Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, April 24th, 2023. And I'm the host of the show, Cara Santamaria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I do want to take a moment to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible week after week. Talk Nerdy heavily relies on the support of listeners just like you. If you're interested in pledging your support, all you've got to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. This week's top patrons include Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Pasquale Gelati, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so very much. All right, let's get into it. So this week I had the opportunity to chat with Leah Elson. She's a clinical development scientist, an author, and a public science communicator. She's the creator and host of 60 Seconds of Science, a web series, as well as the String Theory podcast. And her new book is coming out June 27th, 2023. So it's in pre-order right now. And as we all know, if you pre-order a book, it helps it with all of those pre-orders contribute to the first week sales, which helps it with any book list that it may end up on. So if you're interested, please do go pre-order this book wherever books are sold. It's called There Are No Stupid Questions in Science. And it's both written and illustrated by, here she is, Leah Elson. Well, Leah, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me today.
I am excited to talk about your new book, There Are No Stupid Questions in Science. I'm really excited because you have so much just background and interest and passion. You've sort of been, I don't want to say all over the place, but you've studied in like a lot of different areas, and you've been biomedical mostly, right? But also epidemiology. So biotech, epidemiology. Help me understand where you're coming from.
There's a lot. Well, I'm big on people ask me, what do you want to do in 5 years or 10 years? What's your plan? And I sort of have always attacked my research career from the angle of, as long as I'm making the maximal impact, I can sort of apply my skill set to really any focus. So it has led me through novel biotechnology and orthopedics. And then I kind of deviated into oncology for a little bit of time. And now I'm sort of back in the realm of novel biotech, but this time in neuroscience. So because I have this broad array of academia behind me, it doesn't take too long to get caught up on the subject material. And then you just sort of grab the reins and you grip and rip in research.
Yeah. And research you do. So you really, really dedicated to research. You publish a lot. You're really kind of involved in staying up with the literature and contributing to the literature. How do you do it, madam? Because this is one of the hardest parts for a lot of people.
Honestly, when I first started publishing, it was a lot of late nights. I think the very first offer that I got to publish in peer-reviewed literature, I was ecstatic, as every young Padawan is. And it was because it was on the heels of a conference, and it's like, hey, if you're selected on podium, we invite you to submit your research for full publication. But I didn't know about it because the attending I was working with missed the email until literally like 12 hours before the deadline. So
No.
I'm one of those people that I'm like, yep, let's do it. I'm sort of recklessly spontaneous. And when I set my heart on something, I'm like, it's go time. So I buckled down in my little drafty apartment in Boston, and I pulled an all-nighter on this manuscript and got it done. And that was sort of the beginning of, I would say the end. It was really the beginning of the beginning, but it was started this machine of publication and research, et cetera.
And so what I'm loving about this book is that it's like the equal and opposite. I don't know if that's fair to say, because you do so much, obviously, academic work, but you also do public science communication. And this specific book, which I think is so great, is that it has a very user-friendly vibe. It's like the opposite of a heady, dense scientific manuscript.
Yeah, and that's so important. I never, I never grew up saying, "Oh, I want to be a science communicator," but it's definitely something where there is a tremendous need because of the vast scientific illiteracy both in this country and sort of internationally. But, one of the biggest problems I think is that when we live in an era of science and technology, our voting populace, if they are not knowledgeable in the sciences, it makes it really hard for them to make informed decisions. And so I've always attacked science communication, not from the position of an expert. I don't want to sort of top down lecture to them. I want them to tell me what they want to learn. And so that is sort of the framework for There Are No Stupid Questions. Everyone submitted their burning questions to me. And then I sort of give them the quick, dirty, sort of staccato delivery with, really bad puns. And I don't need to sit there and gas them up and, break out all of my polysyllabic words. That you don't need to do that. I always say if you can't explain your research to somebody who's in fourth grade, then you don't know your science well enough.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and gosh, I remember when I was first kind of entering into academia and I was tasked with teaching pretty soon after after I took a course because of like the way I switched departments. It was really eye-opening, right? This idea that like you don't know something until you've taught it. Like
Of
teaching
course.
forces you to learn it in a way you did not know it before you taught it.
What was your biggest challenge in teaching?
So I love teaching. I'm trying to think back, like waking up. Teaching always for me, like I've always been, see, I'm not a big publisher. I'm much more, and maybe that's why I got into clinical science. I do therapy now. I'm working towards my PhD in clinical psychology. I have a neuroscience degree. I did, wet work and lab work, but I found that I wanted to be in the classroom a lot more than I wanted to be in the lab. So probably my biggest challenge with teaching was that I was not doing my science work.
Oh, sure. You begin to yearn for it a bit, right?
Yeah. What about you?
I think for a lot of things, especially when you get a simple question, I've always thought that some of the simplest questions in the sciences that you might get from a student or somebody, a family member, right? They're like, "Oh, you're a scientist. I have this question about this weird mole that I have," right? It always gets extrapolated back to something. But sometimes the simplest questions evoke exceptionally elegant responses, right? So one of the questions in the book is like, how do vaccines work? And that seems at face value like an incredibly easy question, but it's like, well, I could give you an 8-hour immunological lecture, but that's not what you're asking me, And so I think the biggest challenge for me, especially in my platform, is explaining it quickly because I had always relied on the 60 to 90-second duration that's allotted by Instagram. So I'm like, I have 60 seconds to crank this out. Can I do it? And so that was always my biggest challenge in teaching, was getting it out rapidly and digestibly enough.
Yeah, and how do you grapple with that? Because I've talked to a couple of people on the show now, not many, but a few people who really have like a pretty big following, whether it's an Instagram or TikTok, and they have this important skill. And at the same time, I do wonder, like, are there times when you feel like, am I sacrificing accuracy for pithiness, or am I only able to scratch the surface because, or maybe I can get what I need to get in there, but I've got to break it down into a much more manageable component of the question. Like, how do you approach it?
Of course. I mean, I approach it very high level because the audience that I cater to, most of them have no scientific background whatsoever. So I try to give them sort of the quick high level overview, but there are many times where, then I'll get the odd science expert that will come on and say, well, technically that's not how quantum entanglement works because of XYZ. And I'm like, yeah, but bro, I have 60 seconds, like, and like the nuance of that is so in the weeds that my audience does not care, like that's not something that's going to hit for them. And, I think mostly right now, science has such a tremendous PR problem that it's less about describing the nuance and more about just getting people excited and enthralled and enraptured by science again, get them curious again.
Yeah, absolutely. And so tell us a little bit more about those SciComm approaches that you've been taking in recent years, because not only are you actively doing research, but you do have this web series, you do have a podcast. Tell me about how those things started and kind of where they are now.
Well, so really my public facing science interface, it started with me doing sort of more and more dangerous chemical reactions live on camera on Facebook for the amusement of my friends. And everybody was like, this is so great. Oh my God, you're kind of like the new Bill Nye. You should take this public. And I was like, okay. And so, I once was trying to replicate the principles of a dual phase rocket engine in my bathroom, and I torched my shower curtain. It was this big to do, and it was live on camera. And I was like, oh my God. So I was like, maybe I'll take it public and I'll do it in a less flammable capacity. So I just began explaining things that I thought would be useful at the time, whether it was, something that had come up in media or something. If it was flu season, can I explain how, flu virus, like how are those variants? How come they pop up? Why don't we have a cure for the flu kind of stuff? And then people quickly found me and they started requesting very specific topics. So I now just let my audience dictate where they want to go. One week, do they want to learn about asteroids and, the possible farming of precious metals from asteroids? Or, the next week, do they want to learn about the melting permafrost and how that contributes to an evolution of greenhouse gases? And they're all over the place, which I love them for. So, we talk of space, we do biology, we do chemistry. And as a scientist in, upstream human medical research, it's kind of a breath of fresh air to be like, oh, I get to do space today. I get to do something a bit different.
So I have to ask about that, because when you say we, who is we?
We, insofar as which context did I use we? Now I'm panicking.
Well, just in both 60 Seconds of Science, but also the String Theory podcast, like who all is involved in this?
I guess it's an intimate relationship between myself and the viewers, because they're guiding what I'm talking about. So it's sort of us playing off of each other. It's we together as a unit. It's sort of me, expert, and them, curators of the content, right? Like they're the ones that drive everything that I do. So I very rarely will come on and do something out of pocket on my own unless I feel like there's something in contemporary traditional media and it warrants explanation because people are panicking. So like the zombie virus thing where everybody was like, oh, the permafrost has yielded zombie viruses. And I was like, wait. Okay, before we start spreading misinformation, this is what that actually means.
So the reason that I asked that is because, I don't know, like when I first started in SciComm, I covered a lot of things, and I still do that on this show because I invite guests every week who have expertise in very particular areas. So we'll talk about everything from, dark matter to antibiotic resistant infections. But if I were researching all this shit on my own, I would not have the bandwidth for, like, I have just gotten to the point where I'm like, I can't be spread so thin. So how do you do it? Like, I love that you're like, I'm excited and it's interesting, but I'm also like, come on, girl. Like, there have got to be times where you're like, I don't have the energy.
I try to do it weekly. Sometimes it's tiring, and I've been better at allowing my own point of exhaustion to dictate it, right? Because I have these sort of two parallel careers. I have my 9-to-5 scientist gig, and then I have my off hours wherein I'm a liaison to science, and that includes writing books, that includes the videos. And sometimes I'm so brain fried. I'm like, you know what? There's no way I can even make a coherent video right now. So we're going to pause on this week, and we're going to apologize profusely to the following. But really, I think a lot of it is because I am so enthusiastic and I get such good feedback from the people listening, right? I mean, they are ravenous for this. And so that kind of support is invaluable for me to continue this very laborious, the second, I guess you could call it career, sure, that I forged. But yeah, it takes a lot of research, but I've always loved a broad bandwidth, right? And you can see that, as you mentioned earlier, sort of hard etched into my CV, all of these different dynamic things I've done because I like to learn a lot of different things. And so, yeah, throw space in, throw quantum physics in. Let's talk about it. I love it. I research it frequently on my own.
And so do you find that you actually do enjoy more going outside of your element and talking about things that you're like, I don't know anything about this. Now I get to learn about it, as opposed to when you do come across a story that's like a fastball down the middle. It's what you already study. You already feel pretty confident in that area.
Oh, absolutely. If somebody were to ask me a question about peripheral nerve regeneration, I'd be like, yeah, I can knock that out the park and not even worry about it. I'll record it in 10 minutes and it'll be fine. Upload it, done. But if somebody's like, hey, I just saw this really cool thing on some sort of specific quark that CERN just yielded, I'm like, ooh, let me see. And then you gotta get to dive in and go on a journey of discovery yourself. And I think as a scientist, that's really important, but specifically as a science communicator, I think it's so important to really bone up on what's new, what's bleeding edge, what's happening across all fields. And it's difficult to keep up with, but I think worthwhile, certainly.
100%. I mean, I don't think I could do it, but I'm glad that you still have the energy for it.
I mean, this is not sponsored, but thank you, Celsius energy drinks, for keeping me running.
Love it. Love it. Yeah. I mean, and so tell me a little bit, you said you have like a typical 9 to 5. That's like your, the science work that you do. And
Sure.
then you do this kind of weekly, how long have you been doing the SciComm work?
I think I'm in my 6th year now.
Oh, great. Okay. So
yeah.
So you've pretty much got it down to a science at this part. Like you have a workflow, you have ways that you maintain self-care.
I do.
Okay.
I lift. I mean, I just got back from the gym earlier today. I power lift. So I have my non-cerebral outlets as well, which is so useful for stuff like this. But I try to, for content creation, it gets a little dicier when I'm concurrently writing books. So, that obviously takes a ton of time, and some of the science communication on the internet will take a little bit of a backseat. So it's sort of just what can you do? How can you maximize your time? And I try to do it once a week. I try not to overburden myself and do several videos a week because I would burn out. So I'll do the 9 to 5, go to the gym, pet the dogs, lay down the sickest of science vids, and then to crash out for like 6 days on that.
Yeah. No, I hear you. So tell me about the book. I'm really excited to talk about this. Is this your first book?
This is my debut book.
Yeah.
This is it. I'm writing number 2 right now. Thank you. I'm elated. There are no stupid questions in science. I am recklessly spontaneous. And it was one of those, car rides to work. And I was thinking about this repository of questions that I have yet to answer for my audience. And I was like, somebody should really write a book about all these. And in the same sentence in my head, I was like, man, I should write this book. Like, why not? And so I sort of went on this really wild quest to, okay, how does one go about writing a book? Do I want to do traditional? Do I want to do self-published? And I ended up getting an agent. And I had this wacky idea that the nature of the questions that I get asked from adults from around the world, they're so childlike in their nature. So I was like, you know what, I'm going to write this sort of wry compendium of answers to these very simple but cool questions. And I'm going to illustrate it in crayon. Why? Am I a trained illustrator? No. But am I going to do it? Yes, absolutely. Because that's crazy and weird. And luckily, I met an agent, she got it, and a publisher got it pretty much immediately, and they've been my biggest champion so far. And I love it. I mean, the illustrating was the hardest part. That took me a really long time to sit down because they're a little, science illustration, I think you think of something like, anatomic diagrams and force vectors and things like that. But mine are a bit more kind of like Ralph Steadman, weird, trippy, like the characters look kind of strung out. Just sort of
They're really good. They're like really good. Did you do them by hand?
I did. So the kind of a sad thing, but it's nice. They're polished in the book because they had to be digitized because they were drawn in crayon and Sharpie. So you lose a little bit of that gritty crayon etching, but I think the digitizations turned out well. So they're a little bit smoother for the printing process. But yeah, all of those are done by hand, all 103 illustrations.
So have you studied art before? Because like your circles are so circular and like
never. Thank you.
You have like I'm just really impressed. Like that candle looks like a candle, and if I drew a candle, it would not.
Listen, thank you for telling my circles are circular. That's actually a really big compliment because I had to do so many circles to get that right. It's all by hand. It's Sharpie, and I actually drew in Home Depot Carpenter's woodworking pencils. And and literally just a 64 box of Crayola crayons.
I love that so much. There's a whole new level of whimsy that makes me very happy here.
I love that you get it because I feel like some people are going to be like, wait, is this for adults? I don't understand. Look at all
Well, and
these bizarre drawings.
that's the other thing that I was really hopeful to talk to you about, because I think that with a book like this, the cool thing is that even though you might have a targeted audience in mind, it can be a little bit more expansive.
Absolutely, and one of my biggest, I think, things that I would love to have a legacy as a scientist is it inspiring the generation that comes after me. Because as a fellow woman in the sciences, especially, you understand that plight of sort of being a minority in the field. So I want to inspire young women. I want to inspire other minority groups in STEM. I want to just inspire people in general to get excited. And so, if I can. And that's sort of the reason for the book, really, is to inspire and broaden my reach, right? Because I have a decent reach in social media now, but I would love to expand it. I want to get people pumped, and especially now with like I said, the PR problem that science has as of late.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to ask you about that before we get into the specifics or more specifics of the book. How do you navigate the political landscape that we're in right now? What is your sort of personal, let's say, editorial policy or your own ideological navigational strategy? Because science and they can't be extricated anymore. So I'm just curious, how do you walk around on all of these eggshells?
Well, one, I have learned to just not, because honestly, anything you bring up as a scientist is a hot button topic.
Mm-hmm.
And, I do get flack from the odd ended people that will come on and be like, well, vaccines are doing this, or, global warming is not real. And, you get the conspiracy theorists in a lot of cases. And so I've learned to, one, not shy away from those topics, because I'm going to get flack for any topic I post about. It does not matter. You know what I mean? I talked about the melting permafrost, and we had people being like, well, that's just something they're feeding you. That's not real. And I'm like, no, it's actually real. But what I try to do is I actually leverage those comments, because it is public interface. I leverage them to then comment back, just giving sort of data and referencing sources and saying this and this study and this just came out and it was a massive review of thousands of papers, because I know that I'm not going to convince that person. They obviously have drawn a line in the sand. However, there are people that are going to read the comments and they're going to see my very professional, calm, laid out, rational line of thinking, and it will convince those people. And I found that that's very important. I tried a lot of my colleagues, because the first thing that I think it's human nature to turn your back on people that will sort of try to downplay what you've dedicated your life to, right? And they're like, well, if they don't get it, then that's on them. But honestly, if people don't get it, it's on us, right? We're the experts. Mm-hmm. And I think it's imperative that we rebridge these lost connections, because think about like the 60s, the space race, and everybody was gripped by science and physics and aerospace engineering. An entire country rallied behind their scientists, and we've lost that. But I think that it's recoupable if the scientists can step forward and sort of help with that bridging.
And I think one thing that's like a huge danger is when there's this narrative within the scientific community of like, oh, I don't want to get political. Oh, that's not my place. Because it's almost like, I don't know, I can't help but see the parallel with like MLK's white moderate. It's like you can't just stand on the sidelines.
Absolutely.
Like, that actually does harm.
Of course. And that's what I was saying, in an era of science and technology where there are important things being put up to vote upon, whether it's environmental policy, et cetera. These are steeped in hard scientific facts. And if the public doesn't understand the basis for what they're voting on, it's setting us up for failure. And so that's sort of part of getting people excited and invested in science, so that they can be a more informed populace and help make better decisions for all of us,
Yeah. And so your sort of approach, especially in this book, tell me a little bit about your approach to like getting people excited, because it definitely has like humor and whimsy and excitement written all over it.
Sure. So, the topicality, I think, is relatable, right? It's why is the sky blue? What the hell is dark matter? Just interesting questions coming from the public, right? It originates from them, which I think is very impactful, but also just not speaking with the brunt of my CV, right? I don't need to prove the ivory towers that I was educated in. I don't, who am I trying to, measure that for? Nobody. That doesn't help anybody. So I try to be as relatable and funny and wry and bizarre as possible, because if I can make somebody laugh, they're going to remember that section. They're going to remember that passage. They're going to be like, oh my God, these dad jokes need to stop, but they're going to remember. Right. So I think that's been helpful, is choose questions that are relatable in general, not too specific. A little bit esoteric is okay, but and then just be my weird self. I actually had somebody somebody who knows me pre-read my book somewhat recently, and they said, this is unequivocally you. It is my voice. And that's part of being a debut author, is a little terrifying that this is a worldwide release. And I'm like, oh my God, everyone's going to be reading the voice in my head. How do I feel about that? Everybody knows my weird voice now.
And so I'm curious, obviously the answers are answers that you worked really tirelessly to source and to develop, and to it is that voice that everybody can hear, the weird voice in your head. But the questions themselves, what percentage would you say were sort of crowdsourced? What percentage would you say were just your own kind of mental excursion?
No, all of the entire book is crowdsourced.
Okay, gotcha.
So it's either questions, I would say 80% of them are questions submitted directly to me. And because I, for the ease of content creation, you sort of have a repository of things you can pull from. I mean, you get it, you're a podcast host and you've done science communication. So, it's nice to have a repository. So you're not like, oh, what do I talk about today? So I had this long running list. And then obviously, because it's broken out into several sections, there were some where people don't necessarily ask very pointed questions in chemistry. So what did I do? I went to the fabled Yahoo Answers and looked for unanswered questions where people ask questions in chemistry. And I was like, I got this.
I love that. That's so funny.
So I did truly let the public dictate the entirety of the content.
And so you divided it into, as you mentioned, so there's biology, there's chemistry, there's physics, there's human physiology, and then there's space. How did you pick those categories?
Really, because they're broad enough where they could sort of encapsulate some of the maybe stranger questions that I got, and also I think that some people have proclivities for certain things. I like breaking it up because some people may not care about space, but they're like, oh, I really dig biology. I remember taking a biology class in 8th grade and it was the greatest thing in the world. So, it's not sort of you don't have to read it consecutively. You can, but I love books where you can kind of skip around. So I gave people the ability to be like, you know what? I don't dig chemistry, but I'm really a physics buff. So I'm going to go and read the physics section. So it was really just trying to make science as accessible as possible, not running on a tangent through biology and being like, you know what, pick and choose your own adventure, guys. What do you want to learn about?
Yeah. And really those categories are just that. They're categories, because you might not even realize, why do hot peppers burn my mouth even when they're cold? You wouldn't necessarily even think of that as a chemistry question. It is a chemistry question, but the good news is you might be like, chemistry scares me, yet I also want to know the answer.
But I do want to know. Some of them it was difficult because they bridge several cross-functional scientific categories. So, you have the hot peppers one. I could have probably put that in human physio, but again, I was trying to bolster that chem section. We're going to talk about capsaicin here. Perfect.
Love it. And so, okay, there's so much here. There's so much to unpack. I'm so excited. I'm curious, as you're going through and you're picking, you pulled all of these different questions, you put them all into these categories, and probably had to do a lot of culling because I'm sure there was more stuff than you could fit.
Sure.
I'm curious. A lot of this stuff is stuff that maybe a scientist has been around the block, kind of, I got a good handle on capsaicin. I feel pretty confident about, this and that. Is there anything where you're like, okay, in answering this question, I discovered something I did not know that completely changed my paradigm. Did you learn a lot?
Absolutely. And one of the most difficult questions to answer concisely was, why can't anything travel faster than the speed of light? Because there are two different things at work here. One is just the sort of exponential increase in an object's mass as they approach light speed. And then the other one is time dilation. And so I'm like, well, which one? They're both crazy to even conceptualize. And so it's like trying to make that relatable to a public. I was like, okay, I don't think that it's going to hit if I explain the sort of exponential increase in an object's mass. They're going to be like, what do you mean? And I'm like, yeah, if you travel faster and faster, technically the math shakes out that your mass will get bigger and bigger. It's the sort of mass energy paradigm from Einstein, right? But I was like, that's not going to hit. So I chose time dilation. And I mean, going back, and there's so many ways that nuance in language can totally change what it is that you're trying to explain. And I mean, I stressed about that section for so long. I would write it, come back, read it, and I'm like, I don't know that that's technically, that word may not technically be accurate. And I would pour through journals and pour through people talking about it so that I could really try to capitalize on it. And, you know, the biggest fear that I have is like some theoretical physicist is going to be like, well, technically you used this word and that's not correct. And I'm like, yeah, but it's like, I'm trying to give it to the public and like, they don't know what some of this means. So there was definitely a lot of learning to be done on my part. And, you know, that's the beauty, I think, of writing nonfiction is that you're learning as you go, right? Because you don't write, not a lot of people know this, when you submit a book in the traditional route, when it's fiction, you give the publisher the entire manuscript. But when it's nonfiction, you give them the proposal. So they will accept your book based upon what you pitch to them. So then it's your job to write it after the fact. And, you know, so it's a lot of learning as you go. And if you're a diligent scientist and a good nonfiction author, you really put in the time to ensure that everything that you have in there is up to date and as up to date as possible. And I think I even put a few caveats like, hey, at the time of writing this book, this is what's known, but based on, you know, the pace of discovery is subject to change.
Yeah. Oh, and that's always a hard thing, right? Anytime that we publish anything in the sciences, we're publishing a cross section of time, because kind of one of the fundamental beauties of science is that it's always evolving and changing, and you know, we're learning new things.
Oh, of course. I would argue the most beautiful part, right?
Right.
Non-static.
Love it. I'm curious, actually. I know I'm doing a huge U-turn here, but I'm curious about a little bit more about your day job. Like, what kind of scientific work do you do?
So I am a clinical development scientist. I work in biotech currently. And my job is sort of this interesting straddling of helping to develop novel technology in peripheral nerve repair. So intraoperatively, what are things that we can do, implant, provide during the operative procedure of repairing nerves to ensure the highest success rate? So if somebody comes in and they you know, unfortunately have sustain a massive injury in a car wreck, right? And they lose sensation and functionality to a limb based on that. How can we come in and intervene so that the repair process is maximizing the chance that that patient can regain motor function and sensation? We do some really cool stuff. And as a sort of on the clinical discovery side, you know, working in things that are now culturally relevant, like gender affirmation surgery. How can we ensure that we provide a patient with sensation for gender affirmation things, which is really, really impactful? Or, you know, women that undergo radical mastectomy for cancer. You know, a lot of these women, most of these women, what you don't realize is that their quality of life takes a monumental dive because they become insensate in the remaining breast tissue. And so they can't even tragically do things like feel a hug, right? And it's like, imagine not being able to feel hugging your loved ones. That's tremendously detrimental for their emotional well-being. And so, you know, we do things in the company that I work for, like working hand in hand, partnering with surgeons and understanding, hey, can we take some of these nerves from surrounding tissue and then reconnect that nipple areolar complex that has been sort of macerated for this procedure? And can we make sensation happen again here? And turns out we can. And so we're sort of, as a clinical development scientist, I get to take marginalized groups of patients that do not exhibit good outcomes and have not historically, and say, hey, I think there's an opportunity here for us to do really good work. So what do? You look at it anatomically. How feasible is it? What's the problem from, you know, a physiology standpoint? Like, what are the current barricades? And then how can we overcome that mechanically and from the neuroscience side to help these patients as much as we can?
That's amazing. So how translational? I mean, obviously, you're telling me that like you're making these discoveries and they work. Are these discoveries that are going into immediate practice, or are you still in the sort of like early stage investigational kind of phase?
So it's both. The cool thing about my job is that I am involved in sort of pipeline products, right? Or pipeline technologies to say, hey, there is this issue that can't be solved with what we currently do. So how do we upgrade? How do we, do we dope things with nerve factor? Do we, how do we encourage Schwann cell differentiation to like rebuild some of these pathways? Or I can take, existing technology and apply it. And then that becomes a more or less immediate implementation, right? So it takes some time to obviously amass data to prove proof of concept. So, for nipple areolar complex, you want to make sure, one, that there's not an undue risk to the patient, and two, that those complexes are actually, incurring sensation. So it takes a little bit of time, but it's not something that you have to wait, say, a decade for. As if, like you were saying, like wet bench, you're a bench jockey and you're like, man, I'm not going to see the results of this in patients for like a decade. But that's the cool thing about being on the clinical discovery side, is that you sort of take the tools you have and then you get to be a MacGyver, right? You get to sort of be a patient care MacGyver, and like, how can we make this work now and affect patients imminently?
It must be really rewarding to know that on the one hand, you're dedicating a lot of time and effort and energy into these real world, applications that are actively helping people. Some of them are down the pipeline, some of them are happening right now that are actively improving people's lives. And then on the other hand, you are sort of in your like after your 9 to 5, you are doing work to ensure that I hate the public, but like, that
Sure.
individuals who don't work within the sciences are aware of this stuff, because that's the part that's so frustrating, is the disconnect between like the incredible science that is happening all the time and the awareness that people have of it.
Oh yeah. I mean, even just, the other day, the followers of mine, they voted to learn about the mycelium and the way that sort of we're learning forests communicate, right? Trees communicate with, and they use these sort of intermediary fungal networks to communicate warning signals, et cetera, share nutrients, and it's this massive network. And, people, my favorite thing is people expressing that joy, and they're like, oh my God, I had no idea. And I'm like, yeah, man, science is cool. There's cool stuff happening everywhere, every day. And so it is nice. I very infrequently talk about my work, actually, which is interesting because it's kind of in the weeds, but I do have the odd person that will come on and say, hey, like my aunt got in a car accident and she sort of has had problems walking or something like that because she can't use her foot or she can't feel her foot or something. So like, how does that work? Like, what's going on there? And so I sometimes do get to apply it, but it's interesting that you mention it, because for the most part, I'm pretty hush hush about what I do, not intentionally. Right. It's just kind of how it shakes out.
Right. And it is interesting that there are obviously scientific endeavor, scientific concepts that are maybe a little bit more out in front, that like it's very problematic, that the public is not grappling with them, or that they don't really have a deep grasp of them. And then there are the things that are maybe, I don't want to say they're esoteric, because what you do is like the farthest thing away from being esoteric, but a little more, like you said, in the weeds, where you need a lot of kind of technical understanding.
Yeah, less directly relatable for sure.
Right. But, I think that having both of those personal, and I feel like I relate to you a little bit in that way, because it's like I do the work that I do with individual patients and, with my research that I hope is improving lives, but it's very specific, it's very targeted. And then when it comes to SciComm, I'm grappling with all sorts of stuff. And some of that stuff is just fundamentally important from a social justice perspective, or from a global citizen perspective, a climate change perspective,
of course,
responsibility perspective. And so it can be hard, though, to choose where you put your energy, right?
Of course.
And so I like that you do this kind of crowdsourced approach, because you want to kind of give the people what they want, and like figure out what people are interested in, and make sure that we're working within that paradigm. But at the same time, there's also a but wait, we need to know this other thing. You don't even know
Yeah,
about it.
I know.
I want to share it with you.
Sometimes I try to steer the crowd, with like suggestive, like, do you want to learn about this thing or do you want to learn about
Right.
this, and like sparkle. So there's definitely like a mode of suggestion my way, and I do try to keep a lot of it relevant to what's in traditional media because, like I said, a few weeks ago, last month, they were like, the permafrost is revealing zombie viruses and these scientists are reanimating them. And the public was like, science, no, don't do this. And I was like, everybody pump the brakes. So I try to also, just as a responsible world citizen, to try to not get the public in a panic if possible when I see that stuff coming down the pipe, because man, traditional media, they love them headlines. You know what I mean? They love it.
Right. And then there becomes this almost responsibility as a science communicator to both excite and inspire, but also to periodically debunk and, magnify, like put a magnifying glass over pseudoscience and help people understand. Like, we want to go, yay, this over here, but we also sometimes have a public responsibility to be like, no, not this over here.
Oh,
and that's a hard thing to juggle.
It is prolific. I do feel like that scientists fighting a battle on two fronts, because on the one hand, you have traditional media, which is monetarily capitalizing on these burner headlines, right? And because it garners more clicks and more website visits, more traffic. And so they're getting more ad revenue by literally posting like the most inflammatory things. And then it gets people riled up, right? And people share it. So you have that spread of misinformation route. And then you have the social media front where it's like, Dr. Johnson tells you about why eggs are completely poisonous and you should never give them to anyone ever. Right. And then you're like, all right, Dr. Johnson, let's see where you're at. And you find out that they're a doctor in like underwater basket weaving. And you're like, but they become this sort of like pseudo expert in the sciences because of the either false narrative of what they can bring to the table scientifically, or, they're also generating revenue from spreading pseudoscience, or they have something, they're selling you something. So it's two fronts. It's social media and it's also traditional media, which is tough as a science communicator these days.
And of course, you engage in both, right? Like, you are publishing like books that are, available on bookshelves, and you're also producing content that is carried on social media and sort of entering into those different arenas. Do you feel like your job is to sort of counteract a lot of this stuff, or do you think that it's just a function of like, I'm going to reach people where they are?
I think originally it was just like, I'm gonna throw a bunch of science at the wall and see what sticks. You know what I mean? I never necessarily had an end game, but I think especially over the tenuous nature of science being brought up in a negative light the last couple of years, it has become now sort of a moral imperative. And now I put work into it. I'm like, this is not just me sort of dicking off on the internet anymore. This is me trying to champion something that is vastly important and is bigger than me, and trying to encourage my colleagues to do the same, because, you sort of see these spirals and you're like, oh my God, like this is not true, or this is not accurate, or, it's tough. And, it's like a gladiator steps into the ring, but then there's also 50,000 other gladiators that are there to combat me with nonsense. And so it's a labor of love. I do love it because, again, the feedback that I get from my following and potential readers is phenomenal. Everybody's like, oh my God, my favorite is either I show my kids the things that you do and they love it. Like, I get, pictures of young children in lab coats, making a mess on their kitchen counter. And that warms my heart. And or people sending me messages saying, hey, just so you know, I was very anti-science, or I literally could not even stay awake in my science courses when I was in high school. And like, I now seek it out. I actually like go to websites and try to look for science news because of your content. And that's all the repayment that I could ever want from what I'm doing.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. 100%. I so agree with that. And I mean, there are times when it's really, really tough, but
Yeah.
that's what keeps you motivated,
I'm like, I'd
especially
love to
against.
sit on the couch and eat donuts and not film this right now, but you
I
know what? I'm going to break out the ring light. Let's do it.
Especially against the background of like, I mean, we're going to get there because I'm going to ask you my closing questions. And one of them is really about cynicism. So we'll be there in just a few minutes. But like it is easy to fall into cynicism when sometimes it feels like, gosh, I did everything right. I went through the academic kind of programs, and I checked these boxes, and I dedicated my life to this, and I know I'm on the right side of history here, and I know
Yes.
that I'm looking at these things through a social justice lens, and I'm ensuring that I'm like really reading the literature, and then there are whole movements that are just like, yeah, I don't buy it.
Yeah. Yeah. The earth is
Like, wait,
flat. And I'm like,
what?
what?
What? And then they
Yeah.
have just as much political power, or sometimes more,
Sometimes
or like you
more.
said, on social media or even in traditional media, like there's more incentivization for the bananas headline. There's more incentivization for the Alex Joneses of the world. And that part is like really difficult to grapple with.
It can feel defeating, but anytime something happens where I think it's the small victories for me, right? And I mean, you get this implicitly is when you have a very long academic career as well. If you were to start at the bottom of that and be like, well, here goes the next 12 years of my life until I, get that end game terminal degree, it would be very difficult. But I think I celebrate the small victories, right? So I celebrate hey, I got, a ton of reshares on this video. That's awesome. People are informing themselves. Or, hey, I had this bananas idea to take this and make it into a print book, and a publisher actually wanted it. That's crazy.
Right. Yeah.
So these little milestones. And I mean, not that writing a book is not little, or is little. It's certainly not. And it's there's so many people that I know would kill to be in my position. And so that has never left me. Right. I feel very honored by it. But these little benchmarks keep me going, because it's not because I'm trying to gas myself up, but it is me recognizing that there is a rapt audience out there somewhere, and it's going to stick with somebody. And even one person is enough for me. It really is.
Yeah, and I think that is really important when we can very easily fall victim to some of these cognitive biases, especially confirmation bias, especially the tendency to like notice the hits but not the misses, or notice the misses but not the hits. We can very easily become cynical when all we notice are the examples in which politically, socially, science is being distrust for science is on the rise. But we have to stop and look at all the places where trust in science is fundamental, and it's still holding really strong, and it's the backbone of a lot of how our planet works.
Of course.
There's still a lot of trust in science, and we have to remember that as well and capitalize on that.
Of course. Yeah. And I try to tell people, that are science wary. I'm like, listen, you live in an age of science, right? The fact that you can send me a hateful comment on your phone is a testament to science, right?
Right. Of course.
So even if it's not, and I think that because of the era we're in, there's a lot of complacency on what science actually has provided to everybody. And so I sort of try to give gentle nudges like, hey, the fact that you're even allowed to say the earth is flat is based on satellites that can confirm for you that the earth is not flat. Right. So, it's slow going, and obviously it's, I think there are ebbs and flows, but the biggest thing that I can say is to science colleagues listening out there is jump in the ring with me. You know what I mean? Strap up, get a pair of gloves on, and come fight the good fight. 'Cause it's tiring, but it's kind of fun. It is.
Yeah. And I do. I appreciate the sort of the I don't know how to word it, the authentic optimism that I'm hearing, right? Like it doesn't sound saccharine, it doesn't sound Pollyanna. And so I think on that note, I would love to ask you my two closing questions. But before I do, I'm just curious if there's anything that we missed, anything that you wanted to discuss. I mean, obviously, we didn't get into the specifics of your book. Well, we got a little specific, but I tend not to just like ask my guests to read their books out loud on my podcast.
No,
but is there anything that you wish we would have talked about that we didn't?
I mean, honestly, it was something that I've been a huge proponent of as a science communicator is being visible. because there are, as I touched on a little bit earlier, only 30% of researchers worldwide are women. And so a lot of people ask me, what can I do? How can I, if I have some of my, minority friends, like ethnic minority friends that they have it even worse, they're even a smaller minority. And they're like, what can I do in my position? And I just say, be visible. Because if you can't see it, you can't be it. And it's one of those things where if you've gone through something or you are in a special position where you've made it a certain ways in your career, it's important for people like you that are younger than you to see that, and I think it's important for visibility and authenticity in science as well. Like I have a full sleeve of science tattoos and a little tiny nose ring. And, I brandish it on podium. And I'm like, listen, science is not stuffy and conservative, and you can be cool and it can be a little bit rock and roll, and you can be authentic and not a starchy stiff nerd, even though there's a part of me that is still starchy stiff. But I always encourage colleagues, like, just be visible, because we may not be able to rally the masses at this particular time in history, but you know what? There's people that are younger that are looking for an idol, right? And you never know who's watching. So get out there and just be you and be awesome and be open and vulnerable and fight the good fight.
Oh, such important advice, and I could not agree with you more. So yeah, Leah, I'm curious, when and I think you might know what these are, but when you're thinking about the future in whatever context is relevant to you, we would love to know, number one, and maybe we already discussed it, maybe this is just, a reiteration, or maybe there's something new that we didn't talk about. But number one, where are you struggling to be optimistic? Where are you feeling a little bit stuck, a little pessimistic, maybe even cynical? And on the flip side of that, genuinely, what are you hopeful for and looking forward to?
Let's see. Cynicism is sort of I think, tremendous amount of pseudoscience that is pushed daily. And so the pessimistic aspect can be somebody who is, I like to think, a purveyor of objective truth and being awash in a sea of subjective nonsense, right? That can be a little bit taxing, right? And you're like, oh, I feel like I'm screaming to a void part of the time. But on the flip side, I think the optimism I see is with the rise of social media and with other platforms that are really prioritizing really good, honest content creation. I think that I'm starting to see more fervor among especially younger colleagues getting out there, and even something, if it's not science related, as important as crowdsourcing news. There are several people like on TikTok that I follow that go the route of like, hey, we're not going to push mainstream news because a lot of that is bastardized as well. But they do a great job of crowdsourcing information. Like I think about all of the heady things that happened in Iran, as of late, and social movement there. And a lot of that was suppressed, but it was the crowdsourcing where many of those human rights violations came forward early. And I love seeing the championing of social media, right? While it can be used for the spread of misinformation and rallying the wrong kinds of messages, I have seen it used for so much good lately. And that makes me so hopeful and happy.
Oh, yeah, 100%. Gosh, what a good way to end a really long week.
Yes. Yes, ma'am.
You just put me in a good mood for the weekend, and I appreciate that.
Happy Friday.
Well, gosh, on that note, I guess I just have to, there's nothing left to do except thank you so much for sharing your time with us and your wisdom with us today, and your wonderful attitude. Thank you for being here with us.
Kara, it's been absolutely delightful. This has been the quickest 50 minutes of my life. So thank you so much for having me.
Time so flies. I can't even believe it. Everybody, the book is There Are No Stupid Questions in Science by Leah Elson. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.